out in the lobby. Lunch will be arriving probably around noon. And everybody has a lunch ticket if you registered in time. We may have enough food that even if you didn't RSVP in time, that we may have enough food for everybody. There is a water fountain in the back. You need to refill your bottle and then register straight back. So, and other than that, I will turn it over to Kimberly.
Good morning, everyone. I'm not used to using a microphone. Too loud, just right? Okay, we're doing good. All right. Okay. So I am Tim Murphy. I'm a Farm and Forest Land Specialist with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Sitting way in the back where she can't be noticed is Lisa Phipps, who is also with DLCD, and she is your regional rep. This is just a fantastic turnout. When Gail told me that we were going to have, close to 40 people here, I kind of freaked out a little bit. So it's great to see you all. So I'll tell you in a minute about myself, but who are you? Do we have any elected officials? Thank you for your service to your community. Do we have farmers? Great. Foresters? All right. You can be everything. Yeah. Okay. Do we have any appointed people on planning commissions, boards, advisory committees? All right. Great. And if you didn't raise your hand, I just assume that you enjoy technical discussions of state rules, which is what we'll do here today. So I have been with DLCD about 3 years. I work primarily with the state rules. I work on rulemaking. I work on answering very detailed technical questions that we get from the public and from the counties. I work on legislative review, and generally just have my nose in a book and my body in a cubicle. So it's great to be here today in Astoria. This is my favorite part of the state, one of my favorite cities in the state. So I'm really happy to be here. And I should have mentioned I worked for Tillamook County for several years before the state snatched me up. So it's good to be back. I feel more at home here. All right, with no further ado, let's jump into it. So this morning we are going to focus on agricultural lands. We're going to talk about exclusive farm use zoning. We're going to talk about how land is protected. We're going to talk about what can be developed on the land. My goal here today is to try to give you a general idea of what the state rules are so that you have that understanding and can apply it to your own projects and your own planning exercises. This afternoon we will talk about forest lands, and so if you're just interested in forest lands, don't care about ag lands, you might want to come back this afternoon, but I hope you all stay. We'll also talk about zone changes in exclusive farm use and forest lands, and we'll finish things up talking about 2019 legislation. There's a number of bills that affected farm and forest lands, and it's always good to stay on top of that because next year those bills will become effective in Clatsop County. So kind of a framework for what we're working in. There are 19 statewide planning goals. Those planning goals are adopted by the Land Conservation and Development Commission. They are my bosses, ultimately. The Department of Land Conservation and Development serves the wishes of the Land Conservation and Development Commission, or LCDC. And LCDC is appointed by the governor and then confirmed by the Senate. So out of these 19 planning goals, the two very best ones, except for maybe citizen involvement, are agricultural lands and forest lands. So thank you for being here. So just a little more framework on how state planning works. It all starts with the legislature. The legislature sets out the state rules, and policies, which are captured in the Oregon Revised Statutes. Based on what the legislature tells us we can do, the Land Conservation Development Commission and DLCD adopt statewide planning goals, the 19 that I previously showed you, including farm and forest. And there's a lot of detail that is not necessarily captured in legislation. So the state also adopts administrative rules to kind of flesh out what is in the legislation. Ultimately, that all comes to the county level, to comprehensive plans that are adopted by the county. Those comprehensive plans do need to be in compliance with the statutes, rules, and statewide planning goals. Ultimately, that boils down into local ordinances, your zoning ordinances, and the county, when they're making decisions, will rely on their local zoning ordinances, their comprehensive plans, what's in statute and rule if necessary, and ultimately that comes into what decision is made in a land use application. And I would encourage you, if I'm going too quick or too slowly, just let me know. Thank you. So, agricultural land. I'm not a big person on policy statements. I tend to think they get a little too light on the details, but the legislature back in the 1970s adopted a fantastic policy statement for agricultural lands. And I wanted to put the whole thing up here, but I tried to limit the amount of words on the slide. So I'm just going to summarize it for you. It says that agricultural land is an asset to all Oregonians. Agriculture is the second biggest industry in the state. It provides a lot of jobs. It provides food for all Oregonians and is important for basically everybody in the state. It also says that agricultural land needs to be preserved in large blocks. Those large blocks are usually translated into large lot sizes, which is 80 acres is the minimum lot size on the western side of the state, and 160 acres in some cases on the eastern side of the state. And it also says preserve the maximum amount of agricultural land. There wasn't a specific number that was set by the legislature for protecting agricultural land, but we're just going to try to preserve as much of it as we possibly can. So the legislature recognized that urban development was a conflict with agriculture and rural lands, recognized that it increased the cost of services. The further you go out from an urban growth boundary with sewer and water and public services, the more expensive that tends to get. And it also presents conflicts with farm use, and the legislature wanted farmers to be able to farm their land without fear as much as possible of getting caught up in legal entanglements. And finally, the agricultural land should be zoned exclusive to farm use. The legislature recognized that this zoning would limit development of agricultural lands. And because of that, they very smartly enacted tax benefits for lands that are in agricultural deferment or forest deferment. And that is really probably why we are still here with this land use program today, because if that wasn't done, I don't think property owners would be overly interested in the increased restrictions. So let's talk about what LCDC does and what is in Goal 3. So Goal 3 defines what is agricultural land. It talks about large minimum lot sizes, and this is kind of coming out of that policy statement that the legislature adopted. It talks about minimizing non-farm uses on exclusive farm use land as much as possible. And it also talks about limiting public service extensions on ag land, like bringing sewer out outside the urban growth boundaries, which ties into Goal 11. All the goals are really connected. So So let's start getting into a little more detail as to what are agricultural lands. Agricultural lands are lands that are outside the urban growth boundary. What they are not is they are not forest land. They are not Goal 3 and 4 exception lands. We will talk a little bit more about goal exceptions later. Think of exception lands as your rural residential lands, your rural commercial, your rural industrial, lands that are set up for development. And agricultural lands are always going to be zoned exclusive farm use, or in some cases, if you can't differentiate between farm and forest uses in a certain area, you might zone it mixed farm forest. So, yes, sir.
Oregon is kind of, it seems to hung on separating forest, farm, and I'm thinking of the USDA Ag Forestry Center, where they realized they're really one of the best environmentally is kind of freely having both happening there, that it's better for wildlife. You know, there's really no, oh, you have to do this on that zone, this on that zone. But agroforestry is kind of not a phrase we kind of have ever used in Oregon, even though USDA freely has their agroforestry center. So I'm just touching base that it's kind of an oddity of our structure doesn't envision that squirrels get to go on nut trees that are planted, you know, on hedgerows. And that's really a happy family instead of separate little areas.
Sure. Yeah, whenever I'm not sure why they broke it down into farm and forest.
They never thought of agroforestry.
Well, they do accommodate those types of activities in each zone. Some forestry type uses may fall under the definition of farm use, and in a forest zone, agriculture is also permitted. And this is also why it's important to have these mixed farm forest zones, because that's an area where you can have both agriculture and forestry freely together.
But you're not supposed to have, if you're in the end use zone, you're not supposed to plant a nut tree or a squirrel. You know, it's still a kind of separate thinking.
It's a little bit separate. There are, you can't have woodlots in EFU zones. Now, for large-scale commercial timber, that land probably should be zoned for forestry, and it's possible to rezone it as well. But the counties usually do a decent job setting that up whenever they do their initial zoning. Yes?
And actually, current agricultural universities encourage forestry on their ag lands as been buffers for all large areas of land, just so that it helps preserve topsoil, it helps, so they want farmers planting trees.
And you're talking about like
Agriculture.
the state university system.
Yeah,
Thanks for that.
the
I
state
would favor
university
Concord,
system.
DLCD.
I'm sure they do. But the state university system does support agroforestry and encourage it just as a way to preserve farmlands and to protect crops. And then I think where they separate is what he was saying when it's large logging plots of land, where your goal is commercial forestry, and your goal is commercial logging.
That's a good summary. Thank you. We got one more over here.
What were the minimum acres again, Eastern Oregon and Western Oregon?
So it's usually 80 acres unless you have land in Eastern Oregon that's designated as rangeland, in which case it's 160 acres to accommodate larger cattle operations. Okay. All right. So let's get more into the details. So what is agricultural land? There are two key important parts of the definition. One is easier to understand than the others. The first would be capability, and this is taking those NRCS soils maps, and there's a agricultural capability classification. Basically, your class 1 soils are your very best soils, grow almost anything. There's not a lot of those in the state. And your class 8 soils are more like your rocky outcrops and things like that really aren't productive for much. And kind of in the middle is land that might be suitable for grazing. So in western Oregon, class 1 through 4 soils, which are the pretty good soils, are soils that are defined as part of agricultural land. And that becomes 1 through 6 on the eastern side of the state. But we can't just stop with soils. In addition to soils, you also have to consider lands that are suitable for grazing, land that has irrigation water or doesn't have irrigation water, land that's necessary for certain farm practices to occur, land that's adjacent to or intermingled with ag land, like say you've got a big square of productive ag land, and in the middle you've got some wasteland that really isn't valuable. That would still be considered agricultural land. And finally, if there's land that was necessary for ag practices on adjacent land, like let's say an easement or something like that a farmer's using to move back and forth, that could also be considered agricultural land. So it's a definition that's partially based on science and partially subjective, that requires some discretion on the parts of counties to really define what should be zoned exclusive farm use. So we're going to talk a little bit about exclusive farm use zoning. As I mentioned, it's going to be large parcel sizes. It's going to be limiting non-farm uses. The goal is really to allow farmers to engage in accepted farm practices. As I mentioned, there are tax benefits to exclusive farm use zoning. And because I couldn't really figure out where else to throw it in the presentation, we'll also talk about high-value farmland, which is a subset of agricultural land. So I know this is a lot of words, but it's important. This is defining what is farm use and exclusive farm use zone. It is the current employment of land for the primary purpose of obtaining a profit and money by raising, harvesting, and selling crops, or the feeding, breeding, management, and sale of the produce of livestock, poultry, fur-bearing animals. I haven't tried to say that one before. Woo. Or honeybees, or for dairying, and there's a couple other things, but we'll get to those in a second. So let's break this down a little bit. So what the heck does current employment of land mean? Well, it's land that is in a farm-related program. It's land that's been fallow for a year. Orchards and perennials that aren't necessarily producing crops but are maturing. Land under agricultural buildings, wasteland, water impoundments, and it does include woodlots, but only up to 20 acres. Yes? This is ORS. Mm-hmm. So profit and money. You don't have to make any money at all to be farm use. You just have to be trying to make money. And it has to be an attempt to make money. You know, we're not bartering and trading, unfortunately. So that's a key part of the definition. You know, we always get questions about, well, I'm growing stuff, but I'm not really trying to make any money. I'm sorry, it's just not a farm use and an exclusive farm use zone. Yes, sir.
I'm not really sure what you're saying, but counties have often tried to say there's going to be a certain amount of money, but that is not a state mandate. That's just what counties sometimes do, and it gets confusing when that happens. You know, so that's happening in Madison County, but I'm saying, yeah, I hear you, that that's something where Classic County can clean up and not be in conflict with the state saying, you can be a farmer and lose money.
Okay. Okay. And I'm not sure if Gail wants to elaborate on that. There is no limit for farm use as far as income. There is an income standard for other things like farm dwellings and stuff like that. I'm not sure if that's part of it or not. Yes?
There is an income requirement to get a special assessment for farm use if you are not in an EFU zone. So you might be confusing it with that. There is an income requirement of $100 per acre.
And I'm also confusing when a new assessor comes around and mindset is more in that it's not about the purpose, it's about show us the green.
Only if you're not in an EFU zone. If you're in EFU zone, exclusive farm use, we don't ask for income, but you do have to be farming with the intent to make a profit.
They can
You
still
have to have a farm
threaten.
plan. You have to have a plan, like you have to submit either a forestry plan or a farm plan. Am I correct?
Not a farm plan.
Not a farm plan.
Just forestry, if you're going to apply for designated forest land, it should be a forest land.
Plan, yes.
And they're trying to also change the 20-acre minimum. They're talking about it to try and make it more of a percentage of the total farm. Because if you had a 25-acre parcel and you claim 20 acres of it as farm woodlot, it's kind of different from if you had 120 acres and you had 20 acres farm woodlot. It should be more proportionate. So I think they're trying to do legislation on that, but I don't know how that works.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
Going back to there's a competition income requirement, if you are trying to get into an EFU zone or if you are in an EFU zone, that's
You are
if you
not
are.
in an EFU zone, but you apply for special assessment for farm use. There is an income requirement that needs to be met throughout 5 years.
City limits.
All right. So,
That
and,
way.
and then who's determining that? Is that the county or is that?
For the income
Yes.
requirement.
Yeah.
That's through the Department of Revenue, ORS.
And
Okay.
if anybody's concerned about the income requirement, you can show income via using that farm food or whatever is produced as feeding your family, because that is part of your tax. And then you can also show that if you're selling it at the Sunday market or if you're selling somewhere, I mean, you could just come across like not making any money at all, but show the exchange of goods. And meet that. Yeah.
For personal use.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So let's move on just a little bit more with the farm use. Yeah, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be so short with that. The assessment part is extremely important. I just don't know much about it. Thank you.
Sorry, can I ask a question about this bit anyway?
Please.
So if parcel of land that is EFU at present discontinues its usage under any portion of this, but I'm thinking about the profit at that moment, they stop farming for profit. What happens to that zoning? To that parcel?
So it'll still be zoned EFU. You know, there does need to, for tax assessment purposes, I think there does have to be some demonstration that there is a farm. But she looks like she something.
Taxes will change and they will increase.
At what point do they change? Like when there's
When they're
reassessment?
surveyed the next assessment. So if you're no longer using it as farmland, it is just fallow, your tax will change and it will increase.
So this determination is made at the point when they want to zone it EFU or when a reassessment is done? Is that correct?
So this definition would come more into effect with, what counties can and cannot regulate. This wouldn't apply necessarily to the assessment. This would be, a county can't tell a farmer what to do, how to farm their property. They can't make certain things a nuisance or, regulate odor or things like that.
The issue comes down to the county saying it's not your primary purpose. Doing something when you say, oh yes, it is my primary purpose. I may not be very effective at it, but it's my primary purpose.
All right. So I'm gonna jump ahead in the farm use definition. You see I've underlined the words "and." So I just wanted to point out that it's not sufficient to just sell a crop. If you sell a crop and you don't produce it on your land, in that case, it could be something like a farm stand, but it wouldn't be considered farm use. So a county can regulate a farm stand, a county can't regulate farm use. And a few other farm uses, preparation and storage of products raised on the farm operation are part of farm use. So preparation should be differentiated between preparation and processing. Preparation is you're kind of getting it ready for market. You're cleaning it, you're drying it, you're packaging it, getting ready to ship it off. That's all farm use. If you're trying to convert it into another product, then that would be processing. And that would be subject to some different standards. Also, stabling, training horses, once again for profit. Certain species are considered farm use if they're allowed by the Fish and Wildlife Commission. In that case, you actually have to be breeding these, whatever they are, fish, whatever. And also, Christmas trees are part of farm use. So I kind of alluded to this a second ago. Can a county regulate farm use? The legislature was pretty clear on that. A county cannot regulate farming practices in an EFU zone. It is the Department of Agriculture who regulates farming practices. The statute does say that the county retains some health, safety, and welfare powers, and I have to admit I'm not entirely sure where that line is. Amazingly, there hasn't been a ton of case law on that. And just a little bit more, right to farm. As I said, county can't make farm practice nuisance or trespass, like odor or dust or something like that. Marijuana is a little different, as Willie will tell you. So a couple years ago, whenever the legislature decided to allow marijuana production in an exclusive farm use zone, they made it a crop for the purposes of farm use. So it is a farm use, but unlike any other crop, the county can regulate how it is produced using reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. What is reasonable is kind of left to the counties. We're kind of waiting to see what case law develops on that. But it's been things like air filtration systems. Some counties have actually tried to limit the size of marijuana production in an exclusive farm use zone with varying degrees of success. Mm-hmm.
Whether the county can regulate health impacting activities on a farm that are also part of accepted practice, slurry ponds for confined agriculture lots or something like that that might have a health impact. Where's the line for what the county can do on that?
I really don't know. Like I said, it hasn't been litigated too much, but if the county was interested in doing something like that, I would definitely encourage them to talk with the Oregon Department of Agriculture because they'll have a little more knowledge on that. Yes, sir.
When you use the term marijuana, are you including hemp in marijuana, or are you talking about THC
Thank you. Thank you. I totally forgot about that. Yes. So hemp is not part of the definition of marijuana. So hemp would be considered a farm crop, but it is not something where the legislature has allowed the county to adopt reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. Okay. This might be the most detailed part, I'm not sure. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's high-value farmland. So high-value farmland is agricultural land, but it is the best agricultural land. And there's really three things you need to consider here. It's what's the property that's in question, what is the soils on the property, and how much of the property is covered by those soils. So the high-value farmland definition is a tract is predominantly high-value soils. A tract is contiguous land under same ownership. And we'll do an example here. And
That means contiguous is either side of a road, and the road doesn't make it, it's not contiguous.
usually that would be the case. Sometimes it gets a little detailed into what the status of the road is legally, but usually that's the case. So high-value soils are based on Natural Resource Conservation Service, and they're soils that they have classified as prime or prime farmland, unique farmland. Unique would be typically good for one particular type of crop, like cranberries or something like that. There are also Class 1 and 2 soils, so our very best soils. Also, some Class 3 and 4 soils that are associated with a dairy in 1993. The rules were 1993. What to say? That's what the date came from. And also some perennials that were grown before. Some land that grew perennials before 1993. So let's see an example here. So I've got two owners here, Smith and Jones. These properties are next to each other, but they're not under same ownership. And for the high-value definition, it's based on how much of the land is covered with the best soil. So on Jones, the green soils, which you can't see the best there, most of his property is not covered with those soils. So Jones is not high-value farmland. Smith, however, more than 50% of his property is high-value farmland. Or, I'm sorry, more than 50% of his property is covered with those best soils. So his land will be farmland. And did I lose this? No. Does that make sense?
So it's 50%, is it?
Yes. Actually, it has to be a little more than 50. So, yes.
But are they both still EFU? Is high-value farmland a subcategory under EFU?
Yes, it absolutely is. They're both still zoned EFU. And maybe I should have talked first about what high-value farmland affects before I got into the definition, but we'll do that in a second. Okay? So just to further illustrate how this can change, let's say Jones buys out Smith. Jones now owns both these properties. If you take both properties together, since they're under same ownership, the total of those two properties has more soils that are not in the green color than soils that are in the green color. So now this land is not farmland. Okay. So what does high-value farmland affect? So this really gets into regulations that were adopted by the Land Conservation and Development Commission. These typically are not in statute. So they further restrict how much income can be used towards a dwelling for a farmer's residence or for a non-relative farm help residence. They restrict where a lot of record dwellings go, and we'll talk about those in a second. And they also restrict where commercial power generation facilities can go. In addition to those higher standards, there are also certain uses that are not allowed on high-value farmland. Those would be destination resorts, solid waste disposal, schools, churches, private parks, and golf courses.
So what is the cycle for soil assessment?
It varies county by county. In some counties, NRCS will recognize that there are certain changes that have been done recently, and they need to come in and do kind of like a spot assessment in certain areas. But typically, they're not done very frequently. It's a ton of work for them.
Do they do reassessment in large parcel sales or anything like that?
No, they don't. No, it's completely independent of the ownership. And I don't know, Gail, what's your soil survey date? Okay, and that's fair because it's now all online, so it's harder to track that.
Back in the 1940s is the best guess.
Okay. So I'm moving on. So what can be developed on zoned exclusive farm use? So there are over 50 uses allowed on exclusive farm use land. Seems like as time moves on, we tend to have more uses accumulate as people get ingenuitive and want to do something else on exclusive farm use land. They can range from things that are very connected to agriculture, like a farm stand, or things that just need large open spaces, like our solar panels up there. A lot of words on this slide. It might be a little difficult to follow, but basically I want to kind of explain the statutory framework for uses in exclusive farm use zones. So the uses, I'm sorry. I'm getting nervous. So the uses on the left are uses that are typically allowed by right, and by right is in quotes because they may have some sort of standards or some sort of county permitting process that you need to go through. The uses that are in the right column are uses that are conditional uses, and for that you're probably going to have some sort of a subjective determination done by the county, which may or may not need a land use hearing. So these are broken down in statute 215-283 sub 1 and sub 2. So the uses that are in 215-283 sub 1 are generally more related to agriculture. And we've had some case law on that. Brentmar versus Jackson County back in 1995. Those uses the county must allow, and that doesn't mean they can't do standards on them, but they cannot just say no one can do this in our county. And also the counties cannot be more restrictive than the standards that are provided in statute and rule. For our conditional uses, those uses a county does not have to allow, and they can adopt whatever other standards they want to on those types of uses. And you can see some examples there. Are you with me still? Cool. Thank you. So for the next slide, I'm going to talk about the uses that are on the right-hand side, the conditional uses. So for a conditional use in a exclusive farm use zone, you have to do a test on how the use will impact agriculture. And the test is whether the use will force a significant change in accepted farm or forest practices on surrounding lands devoted to farm or forest use. And then B there addresses an increase in the cost of those practices. That is a very, very subjective test, requires a lot of discretion on the part of the county. Usually how it's done is first you have to identify what are the farm and forest uses on the surrounding lands. Then you have to figure out whether the proposed use will have any effect on those farm and forest practices. And finally, you reach a determination on whether or not it is, in fact, a significant change. And there's been a lot of case law on this, and it's definitely not a cut and dry issue.
So it shows in the community plan that a golf course is allowed as a conditional use on a piece of EFU land. No obligation for the county to say, yeah, you can have your golf course.
No, because a county would still have to evaluate it against these standards, and if those standards weren't, if those weren't met, then the golf course couldn't be allowed.
Even if it says in the community plan that it's okay.
Well, a county might want to look at the community plan when they're making that determination, but really this test is about what is the impact of farm practices.
So they can have in their community plan something that flies in the face of that. You know, it seems like it specifically says, yeah, it's okay to have a golf course on that piece of EFU land because that's how we put it in the community plan. But they can go contrary to that.
Whenever the actual application comes up for that golf course, you know, after you've gone through the planning process, then it will have to meet these standards, and that could be a time when the county says, you know what, this really doesn't work here, but hopefully that was considered a little bit in the planning process as well. Yes?
Can I ask, for clarity on surrounding, is that adjacent property, is that within 5 miles of the standard?
So the case law on that, and I'm certainly no attorney, so I can't cite it, is that surrounding lands is ultimately something that needs to be determined for each individual application. It could be adjacent land. If you've got a certain type of agriculture going on in a certain area, you might want to extend it out to that. It's really something that's got to be considered on a case by case.
Has this, do you know if case law has included watersheds on this? Like
No, not that I've seen.
water supply and watershed? Can we say like anybody that's affected by this golf course sucking our water supplies would be impacted?
Well, you'd have to tie it to agriculture. You know, it would definitely be related to agriculture.
Well, I'm just saying, like, so all of our farmers in this watershed that are using our water supply, if their water prices go up because of the golf course is sucking out their water, they would be, their cost would significantly increase. Is that like a justification that we would see in a case like that?
That's a good example. Yeah.
Working on the golf course, example, but, my understanding is that we're giving them a tax break because these, farms and the other uses are like a public benefit that we all benefit from, so we allow them to pay less in taxes. So I'm curious why they allow what I assume is a private golf course that isn't necessarily open to more benefiting the public as a whole to take advantage of that kind of tax break.
Well, once the golf course is in, it'll most likely lose its tax status and have to pay the back taxes and everything. So, yeah.
I just wonder if you refer back to this question. Was the house there first or was the golf course there first?
Well, so I'm thinking of, in this instance,
If
like,
they're developing the golf course versus developing the house. Because if the development of the golf course was there first, then the golf course would have,
no,
right, water rights prior to that.
I'm thinking of an instance where a real estate developer wants to put a golf course
Okay.
in pre-existing land. It seems to be a conditional use, right? But would a justification for the county or the residents of the county to try and propose that be, hey, it's gonna suck out all our water, so we need to like water our cows, right?
I'm pretty sure they have to file for a, water right of way. Not 100%. And if you haven't filed for your water right of way, you should. Does that make sense?
If I could just do a little bit of follow-up that ties back to the difference between a use as of right and conditional use. When you're developing your community plans, a conditional use allowance means that we use be allowed, but it's subject to strict conditions. And so, looking at a particular community, if you know that there are zones that have, say, a limited aquifer supply, you could adopt an overlay on a plan and say, if a use is located in this zone, it needs to be subject to these particular criteria. So if the community plan might not address particular uses, but it could identify that there may be uses that are water intensive, and that there may be special rules that apply to those types of uses. And I think that's maybe a kind of a good way to look at how you can utilize your information on the ground about your community plan, and maybe not address, because you're not going to think of every single use that might come along, but you're able to acknowledge some of the strengths that the plan already has.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let's talk about dwellings. So here are the types of dwellings that are allowed on land zoned exclusive farm use. And I'm sorry, I keep wandering in your way. I'll back up here. So we've got our primary farm dwelling, which we'll talk about in a little more detail. Our accessory farm help dwelling, which is for non-relatives. Our relative farm help dwelling. Non-farm dwellings, lot of record, temporary hardship, replacement, and of course, Measure 49.
What is Measure 49?
So ballot measure 49 was in response to ballot measure 37. It allows property owners who had land at the time when the land use system went into effect and were able to develop their rights for dwellings and partitioning land at that time, and no longer could once the land use system was adopted. It allows them a chance to get a certain number of dwellings and parcels from that property. Usually it's 3 dwellings per property and usually 3 parcels. The time for filing Measure 49 claims has passed. However, if new, more restrictive land use regulations came into effect on dwellings, there would probably be a chance to do Measure 49 once again.
So just a question, and giving a local example, saying that if they filed their land plan to 3/4 of an acre for development prior to this, because we're now at a 2-acre plot of land restriction, is that what caused that?
Say that one more time.
So,
I'm not sure if I quite follow.
giving you an example, you have 40 acres, and you can't break the plot of land up into anything smaller than 2 acres for development of a house right now. But prior to this, I think, I'm not 100% sure, if you had filed for assessment, you used to be able to break up your plot of land into, say, 3/4 of an acre. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, it's yeah, yeah. Yep. Okay, so our farm dwellings. So these are the dwellings that a farmer is actually going to live in. So there's different standards for high-value farmland and land that is not high-value farmland. The Land Conservation Development Commission recognized that the standards should be higher on high-value farmland because the land is capable of producing a higher level of crops and a higher level of return for the farmer. So that's the basic fundamental behind this. So on high-value farmland, it's $80,000 from farm sales in 2 of the last 3 years or 3 of the last 5, and there's also an averaging method that is in there as well, which I kind of forget how that works. Or if you just have a dairy farm, you don't have to demonstrate any sort of income, just documentation. You got an ODA permit for a dairy.
So that's or, not and, yep.
Yep.
Is this a separate requirement from the soil-based high-value farmland that we were talking about earlier?
It's based on the soil-based high-value farmland.
This is in addition to the soil-based requirement for high-value farmland, you also have to have this amount of sales.
Yes. If the soil test shows that you have high-value farmland, then you have to meet this income test. or a commercial dairy farm. If it's not high-value farmland, then you've got a little more options. That income threshold drops to $40,000. If you just have 160 acres and are doing some type of farm use, you can automatically go in and apply for a dwelling. We see a lot of that in eastern Oregon. Once again, if you've got a commercial dairy farm, and then there's one other dwelling option, which quite frankly makes my head spin and is very confusing, a capability dwelling. That would be gross sales, I believe. Yo, can you confirm that? Is it gross sales?
I don't know, my question actually was, is it cumulative or is it per year?
It's per year. Per year, it'd be 80,000 per year. Gross sales. Yeah, it's gross sales. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So what's the basic idea behind capability without getting?
The basic idea is that you're not actually farming the property based on the actual land's capability to produce a farm crop. You may be able to get a dwelling. It is a I get a little frustrated sometimes when we have rules that are just overly complicated. It was a rule that it was based on a test adopted or proposed by OSU back in 1993. It's really complicated. It requires the county to prepare some numbers ahead of time and get them approved by DLCD before somebody can actually apply for it. But I think you need at least 20 acres, and you got to examine land within like 1,000 miles or within 1,000 mile circumference of the property, and it's complicated. Yeah, it is an option. Oh, and yeah, no marijuana. So sales from marijuana cannot be counted towards any of these thresholds because marijuana tends to produce a little bit more income. So farm help dwellings, so the accessory farm help would be for a non-relative, and that does require also an income standard, same standard for the primary farm dwelling. The relative farm help dwelling, you just have to demonstrate that you've got a farm use and you need a relative to help you with it, and then you can kind of get like an accessory dwelling unit on your property for that relative.
Is there a logic to the no marijuana, or is that just an arbitrary?
Well, once again, I think it makes sense when you're thinking about the income test, but I will say that also the statute says no marijuana in relation to any farm dwelling, which includes relative farm dwellings and other dwellings for farm help.
But just because it says that, not because the dollars are different.
Well, I would say because it says that and because the dollars can be different for marijuana. So non-farm dwellings, back when they adopted land use program, the legislature recognized that not all land that is zoned exclusive farm use is going to and there might be an opportunity for some people to get a dwelling on land that is less productive. I will say that this is the only of use that automatically disqualifies you. I can hear you back here. All right. I hope you all can hear me. I'll try to talk loud. Yeah, you're good. All right. So this is the only type of dwelling that automatically disqualifies you from your farm tax deferral. And if you build a non-farm dwelling on your property, then you might be subject to 10 years back taxes.
Can you give us an example of that? What is a non-farm dwelling?
So a non-farm dwelling is a dwelling that's not related to agriculture. The whole test is based around that this land is not suitable for agricultural use. Yes.
You said 10 years back taxes?
get a deferral on your taxes because you're in farm.
I understand all of that. Generally, it's been 5 years for the last 5 years.
But if you go build a non-farm dwelling on it, you have for that lot, you got hit for the previous 10 years.
For EFU, for exclusive farm use zone, it's 10 years. For non-EFU, if you're receiving the special assessment, it's only 5.
Thank you. For your assessment. Appreciate it.
And it's only for that portion of the lot that has been
Yeah.
taken.
So would that be like a home site or say a shop or a building non-really, it doesn't necessarily have to be a home?
It does have to be a home.
Okay, so it's a home.
Okay,
we're
that's
just talking
all,
about-
it has to be dwelling.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Tim, can I ask a question?
Please.
What defines non-farm in this context? Is it the occupation of the resident? What is the test?
It's basically set up so that you know, you got somebody out there who's not a farmer, so that they can live there. And the test is based around the capability of the soils. You know, once again, we've got these class 1 through 4 soils. So if you've got class 1 through 4 soils, your land is probably suitable for farm use. If you've got other types of soils on your property, then you might be eligible for non-farm dwelling. Yes.
One example we get a lot in the planning office is a piece of land will come up for sale, and it's in an EAU zone, and there's no house on it currently. And so a prospective buyer will call our office and ask, can I build a house there? And so that's when, and we ask them, will you be using that land for farming? And if the answer is no, then this is kind of where we steer.
So for a non-farm dwelling, that test can be based on the entire property. It can be based on just part of the property. Say you've got some rocky outcrop or something on your property, you might be able, if you can get your dwelling, your septic and your well in there, you might be able to get a non-farm dwelling. Or you can also divide land to create a new property for a non-farm dwelling as well. Yes?
Yeah, I was just wondering how often the standards for high value soils and so forth are looked at, and whether there's any competition going on now with that produce water on some lands, make it possible to grow other kinds of crops on land that formerly were considered not very productive. I'm just wondering how much flexibility there is in the system.
That's a great question. And it's kind of a sore spot for me. So we have elementary 56 in Marshall. If we, let me back up. They're not looked at very often. And a big reason for that is elementary 56. If we make uses more restrictive, then our department is responsible for providing notice to all the counties in the state, who in turn provide notice to all the property owners in the state who might be more affected. And this might tie into Measure 49, where people can get some additional dwellings or something like that. So because of that, we as a department cannot really bear the cost of doing a massive upgrade to the soils, to the high value farmland definition. We actually looked at it a couple years ago. It's something that's needed, but we don't really have a great solution for doing it at this point. Yes?
Is it 2007 the most recent they have?
For high value, yes. I think it runs 2007. Yes?
I just want to follow up, Ian. So this person calls you, they say they want to build a house, they don't want to do farming. In that case, can you say, okay, cool, you just have to pay the regular taxes? Is all of no, they have to be farming on that land if they want?
It would be a conditional use permit in our county to build a non-farm dwelling. They would have to pass, they would have to show us that they meet all of the criteria that apply, that Tim has been referring to. And so if they can test that they have high value farmland or something like that, and that's part of the litmus test, they would likely have to hire some
to go briefly into the other types of dwellings. A lot of record dwelling is meant to recognize that people own property before land use system went into effect. Kind of like a Measure 49 type thing. And if you've had property continuously in the same family since 1985, which is when most comprehensive plans were adopted, you can get what's called a lot of record dwelling. We typically don't see really high numbers of those, but they're still around. There's temporary hardship dwellings, which are for a relative who is in need of some sort of assistance. They basically get a second dwelling on the property for them to stay. They are supposed to be temporary dwellings to remove the hardship and the health condition they have. Replacement dwellings. If you previously had a dwelling on your property, you can replace it. In exclusive farm use zone, that dwelling doesn't even have to be there anymore. You can, document through other means that there was a dwelling, that it had plumbing, that it had a roof, etc. And then the county can issue a replacement for that dwelling. Yes.
Is there a timeline limit on that?
Oh, that's a great question. There was just some legislation on that. There was a case out of Lane County that was interpreted by some of the courts as being you can only replace it after 5 years after it had been destroyed. And that also ultimately went to the Supreme Court. That was their opinion, and the legislature got it, and the legislature said that's not what we meant to do. So it has since been revised, starting in 2020, that the 5-year look back no longer applies. So basically, if you had a dwelling on the property at some point since I think 1973 or something, then you can get a replacement.
And is the plumbing a requirement or is that?
Yeah, it has to formally have certain features: a roof, walls, plumbing, electric.
Is that strictly farm, or does it also apply to forest?
This would just be farm and some land that's mixed farm forest eventually. If it's zoned forest, the dwelling has to actually be on property. Okay. So, as I mentioned, there's over 50 uses besides dwellings that you can do on exclusive farm use zone. I'm not going to talk about them all, thank goodness. These are just kind of the general categories: natural resource, commercial, mineral and aggregate, transportation, widening roads and stuff like that, utilities, power generation, transmission lines, certain institutional uses like schools and churches, and recreational uses like campgrounds.
And these aren't necessarily outright uses, these are conditional uses.
They could be either one. There's a big long table in the rule that tells you which ones are out there. Yes.
What's the logic behind allowing power generation on EFU land?
I'm not sure if I really know the logic that the legislature decided to make it an allowed use. My suspicion is it's probably due to needs for large chunks of land that some of these facilities need to be installed.
I'm thinking on that one, maybe like solar panels would be one situation where some farm use might, it's not as great for farm use, but could be a really good impact as far as having solar, having room to put solar panels or something along that line. That would be my first guess.
Out there, a recent big case around Muber, not allowing energy facilities being built on CFU land.
You might be referring to the recent solar rulemaking that we did. There was a lot of concern about large, or not even large, but in some cases 12-acre solar
actually dates back to, when was it? Must have been the 1920s when rural electrification became a national priority. And it's very common, even in states with less restrictive laws than we have. It's very common to have special exceptions for utility generation or transmission. That's kind of essential American.
Thank you. We all use it. Okay, so I'm just going to jump forward. I'm going to talk briefly about agritourism. It tends to be a popular topic, and there's really a lot of uses that are kind of related to agritourism. It seems like state policy has generally been supportive of agritourism. Some agritourism can be done for farm use, like a youth bid. We've got farm stands, wineries, cideries, and coming in 2020, we've got breweries on exclusive farm use land. We've got some opportunities for people to stay overnight. The room and board might be an option for a bed and breakfast. There's private parks, we allow camping and passive recreation. Also agritourism events, which I'll talk about in a second.
Or is passive recreation?
Sleeping. Passive recreation. I'm relying on a case where the courts, I believe, talked about weddings, and that wasn't really a passive recreation for private park. So there's agritourism events, and then there's other outdoor gatherings which may not be related to agritourism, or maybe related to agritourism also. So a little bit about agritourism events. You love this, right? Yeah. Okay. So this is an optional use. Counties completely have the options of whether or not they want to allow them. So if they do, counties have to apply a lot of discretion as to whether or not the use is actually related to and supportive of agriculture. If it's like a farm theme party or something like that, then the case probably would be made, featuring farm products still on the property. And if it's a commercial wedding venue that is using crops from the property, then it might not be agritourism. But there's 4 permitting options that were allowed by the legislature. Most of them are requiring a property owner to meet that test, whether it will significantly impact farm and forest practices. Yes?
So, there's something in the, when I was going to read that's more extensive description of that and events, I think they had a time frame. And I thought perhaps if you were making a movie or you were doing an extensive study and there was an event or something, I could see it going on longer. You don't really, on this thing, talk about time frames of how long an event lasts?
Yeah, I've kind of summarized it here.
Yeah, so could you talk about, like, if there was a movie made, because this county is known for movies,
Yes, it is.
and could it be restricted by the time frames on this?
If it was a movie, it would probably fall under a different use. There's movie production that's allowed outright, and then there's movie production that requires a conditional use permit. I honestly can't remember where the threshold is there. That sounds right. Thanks.
I think it's that particular time frame that I would assume of some movie makers, they would want longer than 45 days.
Yeah. In that case, they might need a conditional use permit.
Oh, I see, so then at that point, you can get that.
Would like
timeframes on these agritourism events tend to be shorter than that. You know, if you've got a pumpkin patch event, let's say you're selling something from your farm, then you might want to get a permit under a farm stand, because that has less restrictions on how long it is. We are doing great on time. So, I think this is my last one on exclusive farm use. A little bit about land divisions. As I mentioned, you're allowed to do, the minimum parcel size is going to be 80 acres. You can do smaller parcels for non-farm dwellings. If you've got like a non-profit organization that needs land, you get a smaller parcel for that, for wildlife or something like that. Churches and cemeteries, fire stations. There will be some legislation we'll talk about here with some utility facilities that will allow them to get smaller properties, and also land where you've got some land that's in an urban boundary and some land that isn't in a parcel.
And that's referring to 80 acres of EFU land.
Yep. Well, if you get into split zone,
That's what I'm talking about.
then it gets a little more complicated.
But he's talking about
Usually it's got to be an 80 acre parcel if it's got to be a few. But every county does that a little bit different.
Okay, so it really doesn't matter what zone it is?
Well, if it's got some exclusive farm use land, then it's probably going to have to be.
We have 4 counties: EFU, LA, OPR, and Lake and Wetland. So, can someone chop up the farmland and smaller than an 80-acre parcel?
So I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I'm
It
just.
sounds like you are.
I'm just not sure I think you want to talk to the county about that, because that's getting.
But the county doesn't know because they turn to you if they have a specialist.
I'm happy to assist the county in the discussion on that.
Okay.
But ultimately, they would need to make the decision, given the number of zones that are involved. I think we would probably.
And they would say there's no court record. I mean, there's no.
My suspicion would be if it's 80 acres, then if it's EFU, then it probably should be 80 acres. But I want to defer to the county, not.
What's a utility facility?
So these would be facilities that aren't power generation. They would be things like treatment for like sewer removal or substation or something like that. Facilities that aren't generating power, and there's just not some recent legislation to allow smaller divisions for those types of uses.
Like batteries facilities,
Yeah, that could be one.
what about pump storage,
Home storage.
where you have a reservoir and an incline behind it where water is pumped up from the reservoir. And then as the evening progresses, the solar installation will power that pump station to continue power during the evening.
Awesome. So this falls into kind of undefined use, which is utility facilities necessary for public service. So if there's some sort of public service being provided, then it's possible.
Private cell phone towers.
Yeah, cell phone towers. Yeah, they would fall under that. Okay, I don't want to get into forest land, but we got 40 minutes, so I think I'm going to jump ahead to what happened with the legislature in 2019, if that sounds okay. We'll do forest land after lunch. I just don't have any. All right. Okay, so there were a number, obviously, a number of bills that came out of the 2019 legislative session that relate to land use. I'm not going to get into them if they don't have something to do with agriculture and forestry, because that's not my specialty. 5, we will talk about those. So here are ones that are related to agricultural land. So we talked a little bit about primary farm dwellings and income standards that have to be met. If it's high value farmland, it's $80,000. So House Bill 2573 reduced that $80,000 threshold for cranberry farmers. There was a strong downturn in the cranberry market. Cranberry farmers simply weren't able to meet the $80,000 threshold, so the legislature allowed them to have a lower threshold, and that expires in 2022 to consider whether or not that needs to continue or not. So House Bill 2844, it exempts small farm processing facilities from county study standards. I believe this came out in response to something in Deschutes County where the county was requiring farm processors to meet parking standards, ADA parking standards, landscaping standards, stuff like that. So the legislature wanted to create a similar process so counties couldn't do that. This bill was originally proposed to exclude marijuana, but it was added back in, so this also includes marijuana. Yes?
Tim, I'm worried, oh, sorry. I'm worried you've got time now, so I'm feeling less happy about it. So on 2573,
Yes.
was your office involved in the crafting of that bill at all?
We weren't.
Was there any discussion of just introducing market-based scales for these, like, for the farm income levels? I mean, you talked about two examples now, the marijuana and cranberries on the opposite ends of the spectrum, where you just got a disconnect from the original level based on the crop value. Did they talk about just changing it so they don't have to revisit this in a couple of years?
So I can't recall any discussion of that. There may have been some discussion, but generally legislative sessions are pretty fast paced. So I don't think there was an actual substantial proposal to do something.
It was just a cranberry lobby.
Yeah.
Somebody wanted to build it out.
Yeah, cranberry lobby, it's some influential legislators and some county folks that were concerned as well.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yes.
So are there other siting standards, other state siting standards that are applicable? Because it says county siting standards.
So those would also be, for a processing facility, there really isn't a state setting standard. Setting standards would be about county.
So there are no siting standards if you have a processing.
For the state, the only requirements would be that how big the processing floor could be, where the crops come from that you're actually processing. But the state wouldn't set things like parking standards or setbacks. Lisa?
Tim, early on you mentioned that preparation and processing were two distinctly different things. Do you want to talk just a little bit about how processing facilities are looked at from how they're regulated and how they're looked at from a land use perspective versus preparation?
Sure. Yeah, so preparation is considered to be part of farm use. That is not regulated by LCDC's rules or by the county. Processing facilities do require a county permit. County can typically look and see how big the floor processing area is, and also where the crops are coming from, because where the crops have to come from the property where the facility. And that's typically an outright type use of one of the standards. Yes?
What's the standard for a small farm versus a not small farm?
So yes, I got it. Okay. So no study standards if less than 25, if the processing facility is less than 2,500 square feet. Okay. Thank you. All right. So we talked a little bit about replacement dwellings, House Bill 3024. That was in response to the case before the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said that if the dwelling was burned, you have to replace it within 5 years. Basically, it's kind of confusing statutes. And so the legislature said, no, we didn't mean to be that restrictive. We're going to allow dwellings to be replaced if they previously were dwellings and there's no back taxes owed. And mostly if it's been around, if it was there since 1973, without a tax name, it could be replaced.
So that's that the building existed since 73, not that it's built.
The building doesn't even have to exist. It could have formally existed if you can prove that it had certain features, plumbing, roof, etc. So House Bill 3384 was directed at a rule that our commission had adopted. The rule was intended to try to prevent urban creep out into rural lands. So it said that schools that are within 3 miles of an urban growth boundary do not have a design capacity greater than 100 people. The legislature had concerns with a number of school districts about that rule, not being able to do expansions and things like that. So we have to change our rule to accommodate House Bill 3384. And that bill had an emergency clause, so it's currently in effect. Most bills will become effective on January 1st, 2020. This one's already in effect. Farm breweries. Senate Bill 287. This was based on previous statutes that allowed wineries and then cider businesses on lands of exclusive farm use. The legislature decided to include farm breweries this biennium. It will be a use that counties will not have to require a conditional use permit for. There has to be a 15-acre hop farm or some other types of ingredients that are used in brewing that make up 15 acres. There's a 15,000 barrel cap on what can be produced on site. And these types of breweries can do things like small food service, agritourism, events, things like that. Very, very similar to what's allowed in wineries inside of businesses.
Hey, Sam, could you go back? I was still trying to absorb something and then didn't get a chance to ask you back to 3384, just to,
Yeah.
could you just restate that or
Give us
explain?
an example.
Yeah, just, my head's wrapped around the wrong way, I think.
No problem. So we've got a school. Let me think of my example before I give you one.
I'm thinking of like Hillsborough, where they built all around us, we're on a farm area, and they built all around us, there's a school nearby, but I'm trying to place what this has to do with it, because I didn't follow this.
So let's say this. We've got all land exempt exclusive farm use is within 1 mile of an urban growth boundary. Somebody wants to put a school out there on the land exempt exclusive farm use. Our rules, LCDC rules, before this bill would say that that school cannot have a design capacity greater than 100 people. Because of this bill, that design capacity requirement. So the school can build however big it wants. There's still requirements that primarily for residents of a rural area. But the design capacity is gone.
Thank you. Now I'm back.
Okay.
So, did you say urban growth? I mean, EFU land?
Yes. Yeah, it would be EFU land that's near urban growth.
Okay.
Okay. And the last one on this slide, Senate Bill 408. We talked about it a little bit. This would be utility facility partitions. You can create a smaller parcel for cell towers, sewage lagoons, etc., but not for commercial power generation. No, actually, I'm wrong. You already could do a smaller parcel for commercial power generating facilities. This bill addresses both types of utilities. So, since we got a little bit,
Can I just ask you a quick?
yeah.
I've
And the barrel, how many barrels, and that's, is that operating capacity or?
Yeah, they can make less, they have to make less than 15,000 barrels annually on site. Yes?
We're facing a kind of unique situation among counties here, because of issues of sea level rise and tsunamis. Was there any discussion in the legislative session about accommodating some, I hate to use the word exception, because that means something here, but accommodating the fact that we're trying to move our schools to higher ground, and that, is there any, and that we, we're gonna have to do some of that, especially in a county like ours, we're gonna have to do that outside of UGBs. Was there any discussion about that?
There may well, and I was not personally part of it. It is something that does come up. I think Seaside actually took a golden session, which we'll talk a little bit more about this afternoon, to relocate their school outside of Swansea. So it can be done, and I'm sure that a lot of people are really concerned about it. But I don't remember a particular discussion. Yes?
Same question as Commissioner Webb, but related to EFU requirement, local requirement, currently in the future of having local rise in districts like that. Has there been any discussion?
Probably.
Repeat the question, we
Yeah.
didn't hear your question.
I just was kind of playing off Commissioner Webb's question, but in regards to the fact that all of our AFU land is in the floodplain, all of our farm production land or food production land.
I have not personally been involved in the discussion about that. Yeah, that's very important.
I think that's something to do with some of the diking districts too, not just the, and, we have dikes already that block right now that are dealing with that very situation of our water that already existed to where it was. So as if, I hate to make it sound like it's backs it out, I'm not gonna, say whether one way or another something's happening, but I think focusing on those diking districts is gonna be part of our issue with our farmland, right? Is that are indeed under the what would have been the water table already. So, I don't know. Just food for thought, which is what this is about, so. That's municipal. Just quit talking. I'm not gonna repeat it just for Courtney.
So, how did Monroe County build so many wind farms on its wind lands before Senate Bill 408? Because you've got wind farms, expensive windmills for power generation, wind farms all throughout the county.
So, I'm not sure what Senate Bill 408 exactly. I know that there has been a carve out to allow power generation facilities out on land in civic schools for use. It probably predates that, as well as even getting in the land system. I know since our commission has adopted some more restrictive rules on wind power. So that can be where it is.
Yeah, but I mean, the way I look at it, that land would be classified as farm use, 1-4, because it's producing crops. So it's been around for a while.
Wish I could answer that.
Yeah.
Yes.
I can figure the fact that maybe
found right up to it. I mean, the town doesn't take up much room. They just, the farmers, they pay a certain amount of money for the power company to lease. Okay, that's kind of like, yes.
I know within the city of Astoria, there was a big controversy over the 5G network they wanted to put in. What about cell towers? I don't know anything about them that are producing the energy for the 5G. But is there anything on utility facilities that protects adjacent landowners from, say, a 5G tower?
So on lands of exclusive farm use, there are some standards. They have to prove that the use has to be put out on lands of exclusive farm use that can't be located elsewhere. The standards aren't super strong.
So when you say agricultural land, you mean exclusive farm use?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I can't remember on forest land if that is a use is allowed outright or if it's a use is allowed conditionally. I think it's conditional use on forest land.
If that's a case of a 3-acre EFU parcel that where Verizon was wanting to do it, and it was particularly appealing to them because they were free to do it and they could do it as small as they wanted to. As it turned out, they didn't. But there was certainly no constraint, and it was just an oddity that they were totally free to. They would have left, it would have been leased. They would have left when they left, had the choice of doing whatever they wanted to. A huge concrete block. Yeah. But there, somehow it was like, the appeal was that they could do it. And there was nothing to stop them from doing it. And it was, because it was EFU, it was right there along 101.
It's an exclusive farm use. I mean, there's some standards, but it's not that tough.
It's not that what?
It's not that tough to do it on exclusive farm use.
Is there any differentiation between farm use that is for Oregon versus farm use that is for export?
No, it's all treated the same under the land use system. Okay, so we are up 20 minutes to noon. I can talk about a couple more bills. I don't really want to jump into a whole new discussion about forest lands or zone changes at this point. So let's just talk very briefly about a couple bills. The forest land bills, we will talk about those later. Those get a little complex. We'll get into those. I do want to mention there's a couple other changes. House Bill 2106 affects permanent expirations for dwellings. So for a dwelling on land that's zoned for farm use or forest, if the dwelling permit, once you get your approval from the county, is valid for 4 years. You can then get a 2-year extension on that permit. What this bill does is it allows counties to approve 5 additional 1-year extensions. So you could have your extension period going up to 11 years from when the talk was originally approved. That has an emergency clause that is currently in effect. The other one I want to talk about is House Bill 2790. That's outdoor mass gatherings. Let me grab my cheat sheet here so I don't say anything wrong. An outdoor mass gathering is a gathering of 3,000 people that lasts for 24 to up to 120 hours. There was some controversy over these events. I think this goes into the bylaw proposal out in Marion County, where counties wanted to have additional opportunities to regulate these events. Typically, it's just okay, you meet the health and safety standards, here's your permit. You don't see the time limit. But what this bill does is allows counties to actually require a public hearing for these types of events to address better the public concerns. Few issues, if they don't want to do that, they don't have to.
that's a good thing, because the fact that if you've got a max gathering of 3,000 people, that may be nothing in the valley. If you come down here, 3,000 people is a large impact. So I think that it should go before here and be discussed. We should have that option.
Thinking Country Fest is what comes to mind. I don't know if any of you guys have been to that, but I'm sure there's more than 3,000 people at that down in the Lane County. No.
People are talking and stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Country Fest is very, I'm surprised it's more people have been to it, but it's very similar to that. It's out, you know, it's in out past Corrales area, and so it's pretty, you know, pretty crazy. Yeah, it is. It's a big mass gathering. There's cool trees and farmland.
Okay. Yes?
I'm just curious, the county fair reaches that threshold. But it's fine, and it's all accounted for. But could it ever be in a problem for it, or? And it's 24 to 48 hours?
24 to 120.
Oh, 120
Yeah.
hours. Okay.
Yeah, the county fair, sometimes county fairgrounds are zoned differently, they're not zoned exclusive farm use. I'm not sure what you're.
Because you have Ag 4, so this is still exclusive from you.
Okay, yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So Gail, I think I'm done for the morning. I don't want to start the rest of the discussions now, and cut them off. Got to move forward, so if there's any other questions, please.
Yeah, so, we've been talking about EFU.
Yeah.
Are we going to be talking about the other designations like ag forest and, you know, a wetland or something, or is that in?
So we will talk about forest this afternoon. We'll talk briefly about ag forest.
Like the other, I guess, the other designations that could be in the end, so yes, we'll talk. Other than, I'm not saying this correctly, I feel it already, the other land designations other than EFU, we'll be discussing those, other than forest.
We'll be talking about forest, and we'll talk about mixed farm forest, but in no other sense.
No, I'm sorry.
But we will talk about rezoning land from EFU and from a forest zone to some other use. So that's my plan for the afternoon. Forest and zone changes.
Okay, I had just one other thing I was going to ask you. So I was looking at, going back to Senate Bill 408, and I was looking to see if they defined what utilities works. We kind of all talked about a little bit of what those, you know, what could be on, you know, what the utility is. I mean, we've sort of speculated, but the only time you find the word utility in the whole bill is just in the title. Yeah, so I don't know, is there somewhere that you know that it references specifically to what the definition of that utility is going to be, or does that just get subjected back to the rulemakers, you know, versus the law?
So the bill doesn't provide a lot of detail on that. It's mostly revising the land division standards rather than the actual use standards. So what it would be a utility facility necessary for public service. And I think that it doesn't, it's kind of an undefined term, kind of catch all use. But basically, in ORS 215-283 sub 1C, I think.
And you're good, 263 is on here.
But that's the one that's mentioned in that.
Yeah, statute, yeah. Yes.
And I just want to clarify something on the agroforestry question. The university isn't encouraging farmers to turn their lands into forestry or turn their lands into trees. What they're doing is encouraging farmers to protect the lands that they have by using trees, as windbreaks and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to make sure that I clarified that they're teaching the new agriculturists how to better manage their land for purposes of protection and minimizing, for sustainability, and minimizing issues that could possibly affect neighbors and so on and so forth. It's just a land protection, utilizing your land to the best of your ability situation, and to make it
And the USDA has a grant-free newsletter on ag forestry. You know, if you Google.
and so is OSU Extension.
Good.
What do you think, Gail?
left after everybody's been served, and if you didn't RSVP in time, then you probably have some leftover food. We're going to route everybody going this way and coming back this way, just to kind of keep the circulation flow going. And lunch inside is shorter, so there's a choice of vegan, gluten-free, vegetarian, and I don't think we have any meat. Any questions? Okay, so we'll be back at 12:45.
Test.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Scott. I'm nice to meet you as well. Yeah, it's two people. Yeah.